The dust of the high desert airbase settled on everything with an indifferent film of pale brown. It coated the polished boots of the young hotshot pilots and the gleaming fuselages of their next-generation drones, machines so advanced they practically flew themselves. It settled, too, on Captain Eva Rostova as she stepped off the transport shuttle, a single duffel bag slung over her shoulder. She was a ghost arriving in a world of vibrant, confident color. Her flight suit was worn, the insignia of her new unit, the 77th Strategic Reconnaissance Wing, stitched over the faded outline of a previous, unidentifiable patch. She stood for a moment, letting the oppressive heat wash over her, her gaze sweeping across the flight line not with the eagerness of a newcomer, but with the flat, assessing calm of a surveyor mapping barren land. The pilots, clustered near the entrance to the main hangar, paid her little mind. They saw a woman whose age was hard to place, somewhere between 30 and 40, with lines around her eyes that spoke of exhaustion or experience. They couldn't tell which. They saw a name on the transfer roster, Rostova, with a service record so heavily redacted it was mostly black ink. The scuttlebutt was that she'd washed out of some high-stress billet, a burnout case being put out to pasture in a comfortable tech-forward unit where the real work was done by algorithms. She was an analog relic in a digital world. As she walked toward the administrative building, their chatter resumed, a low murmur of gossip and technical bravado that slid right past her. She didn't expect a welcoming committee. She didn't expect anything. The transfer was a formality, a place to exist until the paperwork for her separation was finalized. Her real service was over, its conclusion written in sealed reports and recurring nightmares that the desert sun couldn't burn away. Her presence was an anomaly, a loose thread in the tightly woven fabric of the base. She carried herself with a stillness that was unsettling, a profound lack of wasted motion that made the cocksure energy of the younger officers seem childish and frantic. Her quiet was not shy. It was dense, a gravity, well, that seemed to absorb the ambient noise. She was here, but she was not of this place. The base operations officer who processed her paperwork was brisk and impersonal, pointing her toward the barracks and informing her of the mandatory unit briefing the next morning. Eva simply nodded, her voice, when she spoke her thanks, low and slightly rough, as if from disuse. That evening, as the other officers gathered in the recreation lounge, challenging each other on the advanced flight simulators, Eva found the base's oldest hangar, a cavernous structure at the far end of the airfield that housed the unit's forgotten history. Inside, under a dusty tarp, sat the last of its kind, an RQ-4D Albatross, a first-generation long-range drone that was more metal and wire than silicon and code. It was an ugly, cumbersome thing, a relic from an era before satellite uplinks were perfect and autonomous systems were trusted. Its hull was scarred with the marks of hard landings and hasty repairs. An old maintenance chief, a man named Elias with oil permanently ingrained in the lines of his hands, watched her approach. He expected her to scoff, to turn and leave like all the others. Instead, she ran a hand along the Albatross's cold fuselage, her touch gentle, almost reverent. "She still fly?" Eva asked, her first unsolicited question since arriving. Elias, surprised, grunted. "The engine turns over. Airframe sound. But the guidance package is 2 decades out of date. The new pilots, they wouldn't know how to talk to it. It doesn't speak their language." Eva's lips curved in a faint ghost of a smile. "Maybe it speaks mine," she said, so softly Elias almost didn't hear it. Her arrival was a stone dropped into a still pond, and for now, the ripples were invisible, spreading out beneath a surface of institutional indifference. Colonel Madsen ran the 77th with the crisp, unyielding authority of a man who believed fervently in the supremacy of technology. His world was one of data streams, predictive analytics, and the elegant lethality of machines that could think faster than any human. He sat behind a large, sterile desk, the glow of 3 monitors reflecting in his polished glasses. When Captain Rostova was shown into his office for her official welcome, he didn't stand. He finished typing a sentence, then looked up, his expression one of polite, professional impatience. He had read her file, or what little of it was accessible. He saw a career that had peaked 5 years ago and then vanished into a black hole of classified assignments, only to re-emerge with a recommendation for a low-intensity, non-command role. To Madsen, the answer was obvious: burnout. A good soldier who had hit her limit and was now being passed down the line. Captain Rostova, he began, his tone perfectly level. Welcome to the 77th. I've reviewed your file. It's concise. He let the word hang in the air, a subtle accusation. This is a forward-thinking unit. We are at the bleeding edge of unmanned aerial reconnaissance. Our pilots are the best. Our systems are the best. The human element is supervisory. We manage the machines that do the real work. He was setting the stage, drawing a clear line between his world of progress and her presumed past of outdated, hands-on grit. Your record indicates significant flight hours in older systems. That experience is, with all due respect, largely obsolete here. Your role will be in mission analysis, post-flight data collation. Important work, of course, but it's ground-based. You understand. Eva met his gaze without blinking. Her own was clear and steady, betraying nothing. "Understand, sir," she said. Her voice was calm, devoid of the defensiveness he had expected. This unnerved him more than an argument would have. He wanted a reaction, some acknowledgement of the demotion her new role represented. He got nothing but quiet acceptance. "Good," he said, tapping a stylus on his desk. "Lieutenant Vorchek, our lead simulation strategist, will be your immediate supervisor. He's young, but he's one of the brightest minds we have. He designed the latest training protocols. You'll learn our operational language from him." The insult was deliberate. Assigning a decorated captain to be supervised by a cocky junior lieutenant was a clear signal of her status. She was a problem he had inherited, and he was slotting her into the org chart where she could do the least damage. Vorchek, a young man with a permanent smirk and an ill-fitting uniform, was waiting outside the colonel's office. He gave Eva a once-over that was plainly dismissive. "Captain," he said, the title laced with a hint of irony. "Vorchek," the colonel said, "I'd be bringing you up to speed. It's pretty simple stuff, mostly automated. The systems flag any anomalies, and you just double-check the logs. Try to keep up." His condescension was a blunt instrument. In his eyes, she was a legacy hire, a favor being done for some forgotten general. He saw the faded fabric of her flight suit, the lack of any prestigious academy ring on her finger, and wrote her off completely. He led her not to the main control center, the nerve center of the base, but to a small, windowless office in the back, furnished with a single outdated terminal. "This is your station," he said with a wave. "The daily logs will populate here. Just follow the checklist. Any questions, ask one of the sergeants." He didn't offer to answer them himself. He turned and left, already focused on more important things, leaving her in the sterile silence of the room. She was dismissed, relegated to the margins, exactly as they intended. Eva did not touch the terminal. She did not read the introductory manuals or boot up the checklist software. For the first week, she simply observed. She would complete the mundane log-checking task assigned to her in a fraction of the allotted time, her mind processing the data with an efficiency that went unnoticed because she never reported her early completion. The rest of her duty hours were spent in a state of active stillness. She would stand at the back of the primary simulation chamber, a silent shadow against the wall, watching the young pilots navigate complex, high-fidelity scenarios. She watched their hands dance across touchscreens, saw how they relied entirely on the predictive threat indicators and automated evasion protocols. They were good systems managers, excellent gamers. But she saw what they didn't. They never looked at the raw data. They never cross-referenced the telemetry with the visual feed or questioned the machine's interpretation of the world. They trusted the code implicitly. Their eyes were fixed on the clean, processed icons on the map, not the grainy, ambiguous reality those icons represented. During these observations, her hand would sometimes unconsciously drift to her left forearm. When she was alone, back in her sparse quarters, or in the quiet hangar with the Albatross, she would sometimes roll up her sleeve. There, etched in faded black ink that had softened with time, was a tattoo. It was a complex, beautiful, and brutal design. A serpent with scales like interlocking circuits coiled tightly around a compass rose. But the compass was broken, its cardinal points fractured and askew, the needle spinning uselessly. It was a symbol of navigation in chaos, of finding a way when all known directions had failed. It was the unofficial insignia of a unit that did not officially exist. To anyone else, it was just an old, strange tattoo. To the few who knew, it was a testament to survival in missions that had no right of return. In the evenings, she returned to the old hangar. Elias, the maintenance chief, had grown accustomed to her presence. He never asked questions, a courtesy she repaid with a quiet companionship that was more comfortable than any conversation. She didn't talk about her past. She talked about the Albatross. She pored over the original schematics, brittle pages of paper that smelled of dust and time. Her fingers traced the wiring diagrams, the hydraulic lines, the analog control interfaces. She learned its language, the creaks and groans of its old bones, the specific hum of its power converters. She cleaned its sensors with a gentle, practiced hand and recalibrated its manual flight controls, bypassing the defunct automated systems entirely. Elias watched, his initial curiosity turning into a quiet respect. He had seen generations of pilots come and go, but he had never seen anyone connect with a machine like this. She wasn't fixing it. She was communing with it. One afternoon, Lieutenant Vorchek swaggered into the hangar, looking for a spare part for one of the new drones. He saw Eva elbow-deep in the Albatross's main avionics bay and laughed. "Still playing with the museum piece, Captain?" he sneered. "You know, we have simulators that can perfectly replicate flying one of these things." If you're feeling nostalgic, Eva slowly extracted herself from the wiring, a smudge of grease on her cheek. She looked at him, her gaze flat and unreadable. A simulator can't replicate the feeling of asymmetric wing loading in a high-G turn, she said, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Or the feedback shift in the hydraulic lines just before a stall. A simulator teaches you the rules. It doesn't teach you how to listen. Vorchek just shook his head, baffled and amused by her earnestness. "Whatever you say, Captain." He retrieved his part and left, chuckling to himself. He would tell the other pilots about the crazy burnout captain who talked to the junk drone like it was alive. He had no way of knowing he had just been given a lesson from one of the greatest pilots of her generation. He had no idea what the broken compass on her arm truly meant. He only saw a relic talking to a relic. The pressure began to build on a Tuesday. Lieutenant Vorchek, puffed up with pride, had designed a new, ultimate training scenario. He called it Operation Solar Serpent. It was a multi-drone, deep-penetration reconnaissance simulation over a hostile continent, complicated by a massive, simulated coronal mass ejection, a solar flare. The flare was designed to cripple satellite communications and GPS, forcing the pilots to rely on the drone's inertial navigation and autonomous systems. It was meant to be the final, triumphant test of the 77TH's technological superiority. Colonel Madsen observed from the command platform, a satisfied smile on his face. The simulation began flawlessly. 6 advanced Reaper 2 drones streaked across the virtual landscape, their sensor data streaming back in a torrent of clean, intelligible information. The young pilots were in their element, managing their assets with detached, video game precision. Vorchek stood beside the colonel, providing smug commentary. "As you can see, sir, even with total comms blackout, the onboard AI adjusts seamlessly. They are navigating by terrain, contour matching, and celestial inertial backups. They are completely independent." Then the flare hit. The simulation's parameters, coded by Vorchek with an extra layer of malicious complexity he hadn't fully tested, cascaded through the system. The screens didn't just show a loss of satellite lock. They flickered and died. The drone icons on the main map froze, then vanished one by one. A cacophony of automated alarms blared through the control room. "What's happening?" Madsen snapped, his smile vanishing. "It's a glitch, sir," Vorchek stammered, his face paling as he furiously typed at a console. The flare simulation must have generated a feedback loop. It's shorting out the virtual avionics. They're not responding to commands. The pilots, who moments before had been calm and confident, were now panicked. Their controls were dead. The screens that were supposed to give them a god's-eye view of the battlefield were now filled with static and error codes. "Reboot the system," one shouted. "I'm trying." "It's not responding," another yelled back. They were helpless, their digital lifelines severed. They were managers whose machines had just gone on strike. In the back of the room, Eva Rostova stood, her arms crossed. She had been watching the whole spectacle with an unnerving calm. She saw the Cascade failure for what it was, a system so complex, so reliant on its own perfection, that a single unexpected variable could bring the entire structure crashing down. The designers had forgotten to build in a fail-safe for utter, catastrophic failure. They had never imagined a scenario where the pilot needed to be more than a supervisor. While Madsen tore into a stammering Voracek and the pilots descended into frustrated finger-pointing, Eva turned and walked out of the simulation chamber. Her footsteps were silent, her departure unnoticed in the chaos. She didn't go to her office or the barracks. She walked with a calm, deliberate purpose across the sun-baked tarmac, straight toward the old, forgotten hangar at the edge of the world. The rising tension in the control room was a familiar symphony to her, the overture to a disaster she had seen play out with real lives on the line. But here, in this sterile environment, it was just an opportunity, a chance to speak the only language they might be forced to understand. Elias was buffing a tarnished section of the Albatross's nose cone when Eva entered the hangar. She didn't speak. She walked directly to the drone's ground control station, a hulking console of analog dials, heavy switches, and a single, low-resolution monochrome monitor. It looked like a piece of history compared to the sleek, holographic interfaces in the main sim chamber. She flipped a series of guarded switches. A low, powerful hum filled the hangar as the console's generators whined to life. Elias stopped his work, watching her with a knowing look. "Patching you into the sim network," he said, moving to a nearby junction box. "Found a back door into their system core." A maintenance line they forgot to decommission. He plugged in a thick, heavy cable. "You're on the main simulation floor." The chaos had reached its peak. Madsen had ordered a full system purge, but it would take hours, a humiliating failure that would be noted in his own performance review. Voracek was frantically trying to isolate his corrupted code, his earlier arrogance replaced by beads of sweat on his forehead. Suddenly, a new icon appeared on the main tactical display. It wasn't the sleek, stylized icon of a Reaper 2. It was a simple, blocky chevron, labeled RQ, 4D Albatross. A murmur went through the room. "Who is that?" Madsen demanded. "I don't know, sir," an operator replied. "It's not one of ours. It looks like it's being controlled manually. All autonomous assists are offline." Eva's hands moved over the ancient console with a fluid, practiced grace. She wasn't managing a system. She was flying an aircraft. Her right hand rested on a heavy, weighted joystick, her left on the throttle quadrant. Her feet, hidden beneath the console, worked the rudder pedals. She wasn't sending commands. She was feeling the machine. On the screen, the Albatross lumbered into the virtual sky. It was slower, less agile than the other drones, but it was stable. Eva ignored the lingering effects of the simulated solar flare. The Albatross didn't need GPS. It didn't need satellite comms. She was navigating by hand, using the raw visual feed from the drone's simple camera and the numbers from its gyroscope and altimeter. She cross-referenced the blurry, monochrome landscape below with a paper map she had pinned to the console. She was flying by sight and by feel, a dead reckoning of skill and instinct. One by one, she located the 6 downed Reaper drones, which were now executing random, uncontrolled flight patterns. She couldn't control them, but she could herd them, flying complex, intercepting patterns. She used the Albatross's significant radar signature and wake turbulence to nudge the confused Reaper AIs, guiding them like a sheepdog herding a scattered flock. She pushed them toward the designated safe zone, performing a series of breathtakingly precise, low-speed maneuvers that the Reaper 2's own flight computer would have deemed impossible. The pilots in the control room watched, utterly silent. They were witnessing a level of pure flying skill that they had never conceived of. She wasn't using any of the tools they relied on. There were no predictive overlays, no target locks, no automated flight paths. It was just a pilot, a machine, and the empty sky. In less than 20 minutes, all 6 Reaper drones were safely corralled in the simulation's recovery grid. Eva guided the Albatross in for a final, perfect landing, brought its virtual engines to a stop, and powered down the console. The blocky chevron vanished from the screen. She stood up, rolled her shoulders once, and walked out of the hangar without a word. Back in the sim chamber, a stunned silence held the room. Colonel Madsen stared at the now stable tactical display, his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. He turned to the door, half expecting to see Rostova there, waiting for acknowledgement. But she was gone. The only evidence of her intervention was the ghost of a blocky icon in a profound, humbling quiet. The silence that followed Eva's display was heavier than the chaos it replaced. The young pilots, so full of bravado an hour earlier, now stood by their consoles looking at their hands, as if seeing them for the first time as inadequate tools. They had been beaten, rescued, and shown up not by a rival or a superior piece of technology, but by a ghost from the past flying a machine they had all dismissed as scrap metal. Their conversations, when they started again, were in hushed tones. "Did you see that stall turn recovery?" one pilot whispered to another. "The system says that's 100% fatal maneuver for that airframe. It shouldn't be possible she wasn't using the flight model," his friend replied, awe in his voice. "She was flying to raw physics. Who even knows how to do that anymore?" Lieutenant Vorchek was the most deeply affected. His humiliation was total. His brilliant, complex system had been broken by his own hubris, and the day had been saved by the very person he had so openly scorned. He replayed the Albatross's flight data, his eyes wide. The telemetry was a jagged, impossible line of manual inputs, minute adjustments made fractions of a second before the simulated environment could react. It wasn't the work of a systems manager. It was the work of an artist, a master musician playing an instrument to its absolute limits and beyond. Colonel Madsen had retreated to his office, the door shut. He pulled up Rostova's file again, staring at the blacked-out sections as if he could burn through the ink with his gaze alone. Burnout no longer fit. What he had seen was the opposite of burnout. It was a white-hot core of pure competence, shielded by a layer of absolute indifference. The official explanation on her transfer was operational reassignment due to psychological stressors. It was a standard, bland euphemism for a soldier who couldn't take the pressure. But the woman who had just calmly salvaged his multi-million-dollar training exercise without breaking a sweat was the least stressed person on the entire base. He made a call to a contact at command personnel. "I need to know about a Captain Eva Rostova," he said, keeping his voice low. "The file I have is a ghost story. I need the real 1-inch." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Colonel," the voice finally came back, tinged with caution. "You don't have the clearance for her full file. Nobody below a 4-star does. My advice? Stop asking. Just accept that you have her, and don't question the reasons the line went dead." Madsen leaned back in his chair, a cold knot forming in his stomach. This was deeper and more complicated than he had imagined. Eva, meanwhile, was back in her small, sterile office. She completed the daily logs, her fingers typing with the same methodical rhythm as before. Nothing in her demeanor had changed. She offered no explanation, showed no sign of triumph. When Vorchek appeared at her door late that afternoon, he looked like a different man. The smirk was gone, replaced by a look of chastened respect. "Captain," he said, his voice quiet, I wanted to apologize for my behavior, and to say thank you. What you did in there, I've never seen anything like it." Eva looked up from her screen, her expression neutral. "The system had a flaw," she stated simply. "It mistook complexity for strength. It's a common mistake." She offered no absolution. "No, it's okay," she just stated a fact. The simple, direct statement was more powerful than any lecture. It laid bare the flaw in his entire philosophy. He nodded, humbled, and backed away from her door, leaving her once again in the quiet. The perception of Eva Rostova on the base had irrevocably shifted. She was no longer the burnout, the relic. She was an enigma. The whispers about her past now carried not scorn, but a sense of mystified reverence. Her call sign in the simulation, the generic RQ-4D identifier, had been replaced in the pilot's chatter. They started calling her the Ghost, a fitting name for the silent operator of the Phantom plane. 2 weeks later, the real world intruded. A geological research team operating in the treacherous, politically volatile Dragon's Tooth mountain range went silent. Their last transmission was a panicked report of a sudden, violent, and completely unforecasted geomagnetic storm. All satellite links to the region were dead, and the terrain, a labyrinth of narrow canyons and sheer cliffs, made low-altitude manned flights suicidal. It was the exact kind of scenario the 77th was designed for. The problem was, the Dragon's Tooth range was notorious for its magnetic anomalies, the very thing that the storm had now amplified 1,000-fold. The Reaper 2 drones, with their sensitive, high-performance magnetometers and reliance on GPS for fine navigation, were useless. Their guidance systems would be instantly scrambled. Colonel Madsen stood before the tactical map in the command center, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. High Command wanted a solution, and they wanted it yesterday. Lives were on the line. Every proposal his team of bright young officers put forward was a dead end. "We can't risk a Reaper," Voracek said, his tone now sober and realistic. "The moment it enters the storm's primary field, it will go blind. Best case, it crashes. Worst case, it drifts across the border and creates an international incident." Madsen ran a hand over his face. He was out of options. His bleeding-edge technology, the pride of his command, was defeated by a tantrum of nature. Then, his eyes fell on Eva, who was standing in her usual spot at the back of the room, observing. She hadn't said a word. An idea, born of desperation and the memory of the simulation, began to form in his mind. It was a colossal risk. Relying on an obsolete drone and a pilot whose history was a classified mystery was career suicide if it failed. But the alternative was to do nothing, and that was worse. "Captain Rostova," he said, his voice cutting through the tense murmurings. The entire room turned to look at her. "The Albatross. You made it dance in the simulator. Can you fly it through that storm for real?" Eva's gaze met his. There was no hesitation, no flicker of doubt. "Its navigation is analog," she stated, not as a boast, but as a simple assessment of the tool. "It's shielded for high electromagnetic pulse environments. It won't go blind. It will just be deaf. I can fly it." Madsen took a deep breath. He was betting his career on her quiet confidence. "Get it ready," he ordered Elias over the comms. "Fuel it, run the pre-flight." Captain Rostova is taking it up. An hour later, Eva was in the old hangar, seated at the familiar console. This time, the stakes were real. The low-resolution monitor displayed the grainy, black-and-white feed from the Albatross's camera as it took off, its single turbofan engine a defiant roar against the darkening sky. She flew it eastward, toward the storm wall that showed on weather radar as a churning mass of violent energy. As the Albatross entered the storm, the screen fizzed with static. The radio link, her only connection to the base, dissolved into a hiss. She was alone. For the next 4 hours, she flew purely on instinct and the archaic instruments before her. Her world shrank to the compass, the altimeter, and the artificial horizon. The drone was buffeted by extreme winds, its wings groaning under the strain. On her monitor, the landscape below was a chaotic blur of snow and rock, visible only in brief flashes. But Eva was serene. This was her natural element, chaos. This was where she thrived. She wasn't fighting the storm. She was flowing with it, using its own currents to navigate, feeling the pressure changes through the subtle feedback in the controls. Slowly, methodically, she mapped the canyons, cross-referencing the fleeting glimpses of terrain with her paper map. Finally, she saw it. A faint thermal signature, sheltered beneath a rock overhang. The research team. She couldn't talk to them, and she couldn't talk to the base. So she did the only thing she could. She brought the Albatross into a tight, stable orbit directly above their position, a silent, circling beacon in the heart of the storm. She held it there, fighting the hurricane-force winds with constant, minute adjustments, for 2 solid hours until a specially equipped heavy-lift helicopter, following her drone's transponder signal, could punch through the storm's edge and winch the grateful scientists to safety. When the Albatross finally landed back at the base, its fuselage caked in ice, Eva simply powered down the console and stood up. She had been in the seat for nearly 7 hours straight. Madsen and the entire command staff were waiting for her in the hangar. The weight of their combined stare was immense, but it didn't seem to touch her. "Report, Captain," Madsen said, his voice filled with a respect that was now absolute. Eva looked at him, her face pale with fatigue, but her eyes clear. 3 survivors. Position marked. Rescue complete, she said, and then she walked past them, her shoulders slightly stooped from exhaustion, leaving a hangar full of the most advanced minds in the Air Force, standing in silent, profound awe of the woman they had once dismissed as a relic. The successful rescue of the geological team sent ripples all the way to the Pentagon. It was a textbook example of overcoming an impossible situation, but the how was what baffled the top brass. A decommissioned drone, flown manually by a single, obscure captain through a level 5 geomagnetic storm, was not a scenario covered in any modern military doctrine. It was a story that sounded more like a legend than an after-action report. The official inquiry demanded a personal visit. 4-star General Thorne was a man who was himself a legend. He had come up through the shadowy world of special operations, a commander who had seen more combat than most of his peers had seen training exercises. His presence on the base was like a sudden drop in barometric pressure. Everyone felt it. He was there to understand the failure of the billion-dollar Reaper 2 program, not to celebrate the success of its antique predecessor. Madsen presented the mission data in the main briefing room. He gave a factual, dry account of the events, ending with, "The successful location and recovery were entirely due to the skill of Captain Rostova." He gestured to Eva, who stood at the side of the room, as still and silent as ever. General Thorne, a tall man with piercing blue eyes and a face like carved granite, listened with an impatient expression. He was a man of action, not of data points and presentations. When Madsen finished, the general didn't applaud. He turned his steely gaze toward Eva. "Captain Rostova," he began, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "The report says you flew the RQ-4D without satellite or inertial guidance for over 6 hours in extreme weather. That you navigated by hand." He took a step toward her, his eyes scanning her uniform, her posture. He was assessing her, the way a predator assesses its prey. "That's a nice story. I want to know how you really did it." As he moved closer, Eva shifted her weight slightly. The movement was small, almost imperceptible, but it caused the cuff of her flight suit to slide up her left forearm by a few inches. For the first time, the entirety of her tattoo was exposed to the harsh fluorescent light of the briefing room. The coiled serpent, the broken compass. General Thorne stopped dead. His sentence trailed off into a choked silence. The air in the room seemed to freeze. His eyes, which had been hard and skeptical, widened in stunned disbelief. He stared at the faded ink on her arm as if he had just seen a ghost. The entire room, Madsen, Vorchek, a dozen other officers, held their breath, watching the bizarre, silent interaction. Thorne's face, a mask of command and control seconds earlier, went pale. He slowly lifted a hand, not to touch, but as if to prove to himself that what he was seeing was real. "That mark," he whispered, his voice suddenly hoarse, stripped of all authority. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated awe. "The Serpent's Compass. Unit 734. The Ghost Program." He looked up from the tattoo to her face, his gaze now filled with a reverence that bordered on fear. The pieces clicked into place behind his eyes, rewriting 2 decades of classified history. The room was so quiet the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roar. Call sign. The general breathed, the name barely audible. Nix, the name fell into the silence like a stone. To Madsen and the others, it meant nothing. But to General Thorne, it was the key to a locked room in the deepest basement of military myth. The Ghost program was a deniable operation from the last great global conflict. A team of elite pilots who were neurologically linked to experimental aircraft, flying missions so dangerous that the pilots themselves were officially listed as killed in action before they even took off. They flew without support, without communication, and without hope of rescue. They were specters sent into the heart of the storm. Nix was their ace, the best of them all, a pilot who could feel the air currents through the metal skin of her plane. She was a legend within a legend, and she was supposed to be dead. General Thorne stood frozen for a long moment, the name Nix still hanging in the air. The weight of that single word reshaped the reality of the room. He was no longer a 4-star general addressing a subordinate captain. He was a man standing in the presence of a living myth. The stories he'd only heard in hushed, unauthorized whispers around secure campfires were true. The pilot who flew a crippled stealth bomber out of enemy territory using only the stars and the vibrations in the floor plates. The operative who landed a reconnaissance plane on a moving aircraft carrier in a typhoon. Nix. He slowly lowered his hand and pulled himself to his full height. His posture changed. The skepticism was gone, replaced by a profound, almost solemn respect. In a movement that was crisp, immediate, and utterly sincere, he snapped to attention and rendered a perfect, sharp salute. It was not the perfunctory salute a general gives to a line of troops. It was a gesture of deep, personal honor from one warrior to another, transcending rank and time. "Ma'am," he said, his voice now clear and strong, filled with an emotion that no one in the room had ever heard from him before. "It is an honor to see you again." The word ma'am from a 4-star general to a captain was a thunderclap. Colonel Madsen felt a jolt, as if from an electric shock. His mind raced, connecting the dots. The redacted file, the impossible skill, the call from his contact at personnel telling him to stop asking questions. He had been treating a legend like a clerical assistant. A wave of cold shame washed over him. He straightened his own back and, following the general's lead, brought his hand up in a salute. Lieutenant Vorchek, his face a mask of astonishment, did the same. Within seconds, every single person in the briefing room was standing at rigid attention, their hands raised in salute to the silent woman at the side of the room. They didn't understand the specifics of the Ghost program or the name Nix, but they understood the language of their general. They saw the reverence in the eyes of a man they considered invincible, and they knew they were in the presence of something far greater than they could comprehend. The air was thick with unspoken apologies, with a sudden and total realignment of their world. Eva Rostova, Nix, did not react with triumph or pride. There was no "I told you so" in her eyes. She had never sought this. Her silence had never been a tactic. It was a state of being. She held their collective gaze for a heartbeat, seeing not their admiration, but their shock. She acknowledged the gesture, the sudden, overwhelming wave of respect, with the slightest of inclinations of her head. It was not a bow, not a nod of thanks, but a simple, quiet closing of a circle. Acknowledgement given, acknowledgement received. Then, while they all still stood frozen at attention, she turned with that same economy of motion she always possessed and walked out of the room. She didn't march or stride. She just left, her footsteps making no sound on the polished floor, leaving behind a room full of high-ranking officers saluting an empty space, their entire understanding of strength and service forever changed. The legend had not returned to boast. She had simply passed through, and in doing so, reminded them what it meant to truly fly. The silence in the briefing room lingered long after Eva was gone. General Thorne eventually lowered his salute, though the look of awe remained on his face. He turned to the stunned Colonel Madsen. "You will give her anything she wants, Colonel," he said, his voice low and firm. "A new unit, Her own command, a quiet retirement with full honors. Whatever she asks for, your only answer is yes, ma'am, am I clear? Madsen, still reeling, could only manage a choked, crystal general the news of what happened in the briefing. The general's frozen shock, the salute, the name Nix, spread across the base not like wildfire, but like a slow-moving, powerful tide. The story was fragmented, patched together from whispers and rumors, but the core of it was undeniable. Captain Rostova was not who they thought she was. She was someone else entirely. Someone more. The way people looked at her changed overnight. The dismissive glances were replaced with wide-eyed stares of respect. The young pilots who had once snickered at her now fell silent when she entered a room, sometimes unconsciously straightening their posture. Voracek avoided her gaze entirely, not out of fear, but out of a deep and humbling shame for his earlier arrogance. Eva, for her part, seemed completely unaffected by the shift. Her routine did not change. She still reported to the small, windowless office. She still collated the data logs. She still spent her evenings in the old hangar with Elias and the Albatross. But there was a difference. People now came to her. A young pilot, struggling with a difficult flight dynamic in the simulator, approached her hesitantly. "Mom, I can't seem to get the feel for transitioning from powered flight to gliding descent. Could you?" Eva looked up from her work and for the first time offered a small piece of her knowledge. "You're thinking about the controls," she said. "Stop thinking. Feel the energy bleed off the airframe. Listen to the pitch of the wind. The plane will tell you when it's ready to fall." It was cryptic, almost mystical, but the pilot took it to heart. He went back to the simulator, closed his eyes, and just listened. And for the first time, he understood. She never sought out the new attention, but she didn't refuse it when it came with genuine curiosity. She became the base's quiet oracle, the keeper of a forgotten knowledge. Her final act was not one of command or flight. Colonel Madsen, following the general's orders, approached her in the hangar one evening. He found her with her hand resting on the Albatross's fuselage, the machine humming softly under a low-power maintenance check, as if it were purring under her touch. "Captain, Nix." "Ma'am," he stumbled, still unsure how to address her. "General Thorne has authorized your full and immediate reinstatement to any project of your choosing, or your honorable discharge with maximum commendation. The choice is yours." Eva turned her head, her gaze resting not on Madsen, but on the vast, open hangar doors that framed the setting sun. The desert sky was a brilliant, fiery orange. "The Albatross," she said, her voice soft. "It should be classified as a heritage asset, not scrap. It still has things to teach." Madsen nodded quickly. "It's done." "And Elias," she continued. "He should be given a commendation for preserving it. He knew its worth when everyone else forgot." "Consider it done, ma'am," Madsen said, humbled to be taking orders from her. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and offered a small, quiet nod. It was the only approval he had ever wanted from her. The next morning, she was gone. Her duffel bag was packed. Her room was empty. There was no farewell, no ceremony. On the console in the hangar, next to the Albatross's flight stick, she had left a single item, her old, worn flight suit, folded neatly. On top of it lay the brittle, paper schematics of the old drone. She was leaving the past where it belonged, in the hands of those who were now ready to learn from it. She walked out into the desert morning, a solitary figure against the rising sun, leaving nothing behind but a legend and the lingering hum of an old machine that had found its voice again. The dust settled on the tarmac, indifferent as always, but the air it swirled through was forever changed.